Ever feel like you're drowning in numbers online? Like when you're just trying to make a decision, product ratings, prices, reviews. Ugh, it's enough to make your head spin. But good news, you're not alone.
Nope.
Turns out there's this fascinating thing called quantification fixation. It might explain why we all get so hung up on the numbers. Like, why do we care so much about the numbers? We're diving deep into a paper. It's called, Does Counting Change What Counts? And let me tell you, the answer is a big yo-ye.
Interesting.
We're surrounded by numbers these days. It's like from APGAR scores for newborns to bitterness units for beer. It seems like everything's got to have a number on it. Even things that seem impossible to measure, like how exciting a baseball player is to watch.
It's true. And speaking of baseball, there's this new metric called NUNRD. It stands for, get this, expected aesthetic value.
Whoa, really?
Yeah. It tries to capture a player's excitement factor in a single number. So it's an example of how we're constantly trying to put numbers on things, even our feelings and perceptions.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, though, why are we so obsessed with numbers anyway? Like a good story or, a beautiful image can be so much more powerful than just a bunch of statistics, right?
Absolutely. There's tons of research showing that a single story, a vivid story about someone's suffering, can move people to action more effectively than statistics about thousands of victims.
Yeah.
Numbers can feel kind of cold and abstract, while stories connect with us on an emotional level. But here's the thing, there's a catch. This new research, it highlights a hidden advantage of numbers.
Okay.
They make comparisons so much easier.
Oh, it's true. It's so true. Like when you're shopping online, it's way easier to compare prices
Right.
than to figure out which product description is better.
Exactly. And that's where quantification fixation comes into play.
Oh.
This paper, it defines it as our tendency to favor options that are superior in numerically presented attributes, even if we still care about the qualitative aspects. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In other words, we get fixated on those numbers,
Mm-hmm.
even when other factors, they matter just as much, if not more.
Okay. I think I'm starting to get it. But can
Yeah.
you give me a real-world example?
Sure. Imagine you're choosing between two restaurants. One is cheaper,
Okay.
but it's noisy. The other's pricier, but it has a lovely, quiet atmosphere.
Got it.
Quantification fixation suggests that you might be more likely to choose the cheaper, noisier place, simply because the price is easier to compare than the ambiance.
I see. So it's not that we don't care about ambiance. It's that the price difference is just more obvious, more quantifiable.
Precisely. And this paper is packed with evidence to support this.
No, really?
Yeah. They conducted 21 experiments
Oh,
with over 23,000 participants.
wow. That's incredible.
They looked at real-world scenarios, like hiring decisions, charitable donations, even policy choices.
Wow. 21 experiments. They really went all out. What exactly did they do in these experiments?
They were clever about it. They kept the underlying information constant,
Okay.
but they changed how it was presented. Sometimes they used numbers, sometimes words, sometimes icons, or bar graphs.
So they were testing whether the way information is presented
Yeah.
influences our choices,
Oh, yeah.
even when the basic information's the same.
Exactly. And the results were so consistent
Oh.
across all these different contexts. People consistently went for options with the better number.
So just by slapping a number on something, you can make it seem more appealing.
It seems that way. In one experiment, they asked people to choose between two hotels.
Okay.
One had a lower price and rating. The other had a higher price and rating. Simply by quantifying the ratings, people became 18% more likely to choose the pricier hotel.
That's wild. So even a small change in presentation, like just putting a number on a rating, can have a big impact on our choices. But why is that? What's going on in our brains? That makes us so susceptible to this.
This is where things get interesting. Researchers suggest it happens because of something called comparison fluency.
Comparison fluency. What's that?
It's basically the idea that numbers make comparisons feel easier, more fluent.
Okay.
Our brains, they love shortcuts. And numbers, they offer this seemingly objective way to compare options, which reduces the cognitive effort required.
Gotcha.
But this ease of comparison, it can trick us into thinking we're making a more rational decision, even if we're ignoring important qualitative factors.
So it's not that we're consciously choosing to ignore the qualitative information. It's that the numbers just make the comparison process feel so much smoother.
Exactly. And there's another experiment that supports this idea. In experiment 4, they made the numbers themselves harder to work with, like using fractions instead of percentages.
Instead of 75 out of 100.
Yeah, like they'd use the equivalent fraction, like
Yeah.
51/68.
Ooh, that sounds like a headache. I'd much rather see 75 out of 100. Did that affect people's choices?
Absolutely. When the numbers were harder to process, the effect weakened. People were less swayed by the numbers when they had to work a little harder to understand them.
Interesting.
This suggests that our feelings about the numbers, like how easy they are to grasp and use in comparisons, play a crucial role in this whole bias.
So it's not just about the numbers themselves, it's about how easy they are to understand and use. This whole thing is so counterintuitive. But does this affect everyone equally? Are some people more susceptible to this quantification fixation than others?
That's a great question, and the answer might surprise you. It turns out people who feel comfortable with numbers are actually more susceptible to this bias.
Hold on, really? That's kind of counterintuitive. You'd think people who are good with numbers
Yeah.
would be less likely to fall for this, you know?
You would think so, wouldn't you? But it seems that familiarity breeds, well, bias.
Huh.
The more comfortable we are with numbers, the more we tend to trust them, even when they don't tell the whole story.
So even if you're like a math whiz, if you feel confident about your number skills, you might be more likely to get tricked by this quantification fixation.
Precisely. In one experiment, they had participants donate to charities.
Okay.
One charity had a high score on accountability, while the other scored high on culture and community. And just like in previous experiments, they manipulated whether these scores were shown as numbers or using visuals.
So some people saw the scores as numbers, and others saw them presented visually.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. They measured not just objective numeracy skills, like how good people actually are at math,
Right.
but also subjective numeracy,
Right.
meaning how comfortable people felt with numbers.
Okay, so they were looking at both actual math skills and people's confidence with numbers. What did they find?
It was fascinating. It wasn't objective numeracy that predicted this bias, but subjective numeracy. In other words, it was the feeling of comfort, that confidence with numbers. That really predicted how strongly people were swayed by quantification fixation.
Wow, that's amazing. So it's not enough to be good with numbers. You also need to be aware of this potential bias, right? And make sure you're not giving the numbers too much weight.
Exactly. And that's a critical takeaway from this research. Quantification is not neutral. Just by putting a number on something, we give it more weight in our decisions, whether we realize it or not.
Yeah, it's like those numbers. They have this kind of magnetic pull on our attention. They make certain attributes seem more important than others, even if they're not.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does.
We often assume we're making rational decisions based on all the available information, but this research suggests that the way that information is presented can subtly nudge us in one direction or another.
It's like a hidden persuader. We think we're in control, carefully weighing the pros and cons.
Yeah.
But those numbers, they have a sneaky way of influencing our perceptions and ultimately our choices.
Precisely. And it gets even more concerning when you think about how this plays out in complex situations, like policy debates or
Yeah.
financial decisions.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Imagine trying to evaluate different government programs, where some outcomes are easy to quantify, like cost savings, while others, like social impact, are more difficult to measure.
So a program that saves a bunch of money might look more appealing just on paper, even if it has like unintended negative consequences
Yeah.
that are harder to put into numbers.
Exactly. This bias can lead to a kind of tunnel vision,
Oh, I see.
where we focus too much on the measurable aspects and we undervalue the things that are harder to quantify.
It's like that saying, what gets measured gets managed. But what if we're measuring the wrong things? Or at least not giving enough weight to the things that are harder to measure?
That's the crucial question we need to ask ourselves. And it's not just about policy decisions. This bias can affect our personal choices too. Think about choosing a job. Salary is easy to compare. But company culture, work-life balance, those are much more nuanced and harder to put a number on.
Right. So you might end up taking a job with a slightly higher salary, even if it means sacrificing something you truly value, like a supportive work environment or flexible hours. Yeah. I've definitely been there.
It's a common trap. This bias can lead us to make trade-offs that we later regret because we were too focused on the numbers and we didn't give enough weight to those qualitative factors.
So what can we do about it? Are we doomed to be swayed by this quantification fixation? Is there any way to break free?
Not necessarily. Awareness is a big step. Just knowing that this bias exists can help us be more mindful of how information is being presented to us.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We can start to question those numbers, dig deeper into the qualitative information, and try to get a more holistic view of the situation.
So it's about being a more critical consumer of information, not just taking those numbers at face value, but really considering what's behind them and what might be missing from the picture.
Absolutely. It's also about demanding better ways of presenting qualitative information. We need to find ways to make those non-numerical aspects more compelling and persuasive so they don't get lost in the sea of numbers.
That's a fantastic point. We're so used to seeing star ratings and rankings that we forget there's so much more to the story
Yeah.
that can't be captured by a simple number. We need like a new kind of literacy, a qualitative literacy, to help us navigate this increasingly quantified world.
I love that. It's about being able to appreciate the richness and complexity of information beyond just the numbers.
Yeah.
It's about critically evaluating both quantitative and qualitative data and ultimately making decisions that align with our values and priorities.
This whole conversation has been so eye-opening. It's made me realize how much I rely on numbers in my own decisions and how easily I can be swayed by them without realizing it. I'm definitely going to be more mindful of this going forward.
Me too. It's amazing how much we can learn from a single research paper.
It really is. But the real question is, what does this all mean for our listeners? Where in your life might you be experiencing this quantification fixation?
Think about your recent decisions. Have you chosen a product based solely on its star rating? Did you pick a stock because of its impressive numbers, without fully understanding the company behind it? Have you ever opted for a faster but less scenic route, just because the estimated travel time was so appealing? It's about being honest with ourselves. Are there areas where we might be overvaluing the easily quantifiable at the expense of something equally or even more important?
It's so easy to fall into that trap. We see a number and it feels so concrete, so definitive.
Yeah.
But we need to remember that numbers don't tell the whole story.
Exactly. Take healthcare decisions. We often get caught up in statistics about treatment success rates, but what about quality of life? That's harder to quantify, but no less crucial to making a good decision.
Or even something as personal as choosing a school for your kids. Test scores and rankings are tempting shortcuts. But what about the learning environment, the teachers, the overall fit? Those things matter too.
Absolutely. This isn't about becoming anti-numbers. It's about recognizing that the most important information isn't always the easiest to compare. It takes effort to seek out those qualitative details, those nuanced aspects that numbers just can't fully capture.
Right. This research is a call to action. To be more thoughtful, more discerning in how we approach the information that bombards us every day. We need to develop that qualitative literacy we were talking about.
I couldn't agree more. It's a reminder that behind every number, there's a story, a context, a whole set of values and assumptions that might not align with our own.
So as we continue our deep dives into all sorts of fascinating topics, keep this in mind. Question those numbers. Embrace the complexity of the qualitative issue. And make choices that truly reflect what matters most to you.
Well said. And who knows, maybe in a future episode, we'll explore ways to make that qualitative information more compelling, more persuasive, so it doesn't get overshadowed by the allure of the quantified world.
Until then, happy exploring and stay curious.